Welcome back to Live from Paris. It's now time for Top Story, and today we're talking about the down-to-the-wire scramble in Washington to keep the world's largest economy running while Democrats and Republicans remain deadlocked over how to raise the US borrowing limit and to avert a national default. Unless a deal is reached, the US government faces the prospect of being unable to pay its bills beyond an August the 2nd deadline. Barack Obama is set to hold a news conference on the debt crisis later this Friday at the White House. Ahead of that, he's been stepping up the pressure on Republicans, saying it's decision time. For more, I'm joined by our international affairs editor, Douglas Herbert. Welcome to the studio, Doug.
Welcome.
This whole crisis is going beyond economics, though, isn't it? It's turning into a bare-knuckle political fight, and an ugly one.
Yeah, you know, they say that the presidential elections in the U.S. start earlier than just about anywhere else in the world. This is all about 95% of this is about 2012 presidential election. Maybe the other 5% is about economics. What's going on here? You still have the U.S. economy having trouble getting traction out of the financial crisis. The unemployment's still above 9%. Jobless claims are not low enough. You have a lot of stagnant growth. Consumers aren't spending that much money. Meanwhile, right alongside that, you have this national debt, $14.3 trillion. You don't have enough ink in that pen to write that number. That's 12 zeros after the 14 and 3, okay? That's about the size of the U.S. economy, and it dwarfs anything we've seen anywhere else in the world, whether we're talking Greece, Italy, Portugal, you name it. This is a mega debt. However, it's also a very ripe target for politicians looking to score political points, because you've had this debt ceiling, and we keep talking about raising it. And over the years, it's been raised about 70 times. It's been just common to raise a debt ceiling. You need to borrow money to finance the U.S. economy. It's just the way business is done. This time, it hasn't been so easy. The reason being that, essentially, the Republicans and the Democrats are at odds, but the Republicans themselves are being held hostage by the Tea Party activists, who are their very, very staunchly conservative base. Tea Party say, ain't no way we are raising that debt ceiling. We're not letting this government borrow anymore. They've been irresponsible enough. The U.S. government has enough revenues coming in. It doesn't need to raise it to get more. Obama's scaremongering, if you listen to him. Basically, what Obama's saying is, nah, this is all just a smokescreen. He says we do need to raise the ceiling if Americans want to continue to enjoy the social safety net programs, such as Medicare, health care for the poor, Social Security for the elderly, military salaries, just to mention a few of them, that they have taken for granted. And if you were to stop raising that ceiling, to stop financing and paying these bills, Americans who are already saying we will never raise that ceiling, they'd start to feel the pinch, and they might start to have second thoughts. Obama's proposing a combination of spending cuts and tax increases, about $1.5 trillion worth of them. This is where Republicans say absolutely not. They want no tax increases. They want spending cuts plus no tax increases, and that is just a no-go for the Democrats.
So if the Republicans refuse to budge and the two sides end up failing to agree on this, what happens next? I mean,
well, okay, what's not going to happen is the headlines you're seeing, the absolute meltdown, like one of these Dali-esque U.S. economy melting like those watches. No, it's not going to happen that way. The U.S. will still be able to pay some of its bills, but it's going to have to prioritize quickly. The Federal Reserve Chairman, Ben Bernanke, basically said if the U.S. government is unable to borrow money, any more money after August 2nd, it won't be able to issue more debt. Issuing more debt is the way they finance the economy. It will have to start paring down, curtailing Social Security payments to tens of millions of Americans over the age of 65, Medicare, which I mentioned before, the health care, which a lot of people depend on as their only. It's not like most people have private health insurance in the U.S. This is the only way a lot of people will get their Medicare. That will have to be cut. And military pay, which is another big constituency, and that's in the line of fire as well. The government will not stop, but there'll be some very, very, very tough decisions. But perhaps more importantly is the psychological effect. We've heard about these credit rating agencies cutting or putting the U.S. on what we call a negative outlook, a negative watch. The U.S. has always enjoyed a top-notch rating.
How is that?
Well,
how is it held on to it?
I'll tell you about that. It's held on to that because compared to the rest of the world economy, there's been some sort of ironclad confidence that the U.S. government is good for its money. But the sense is, if it were to default on its debt, that credit rating would be at risk, it would be lowered, and that would have a psychological impact on markets and investors, and they might start to have second thoughts about the U.S. economy, and that's where you could really run into trouble.
And just briefly, Doug, isn't China getting a bit spooked about all of this, considering it holds a huge chunk of U.S. debt?
Yeah,
what are the repercussions?
Yeah. how huge a chunk? And what do we mean that China owns U.S. debt? What we're basically saying is China has essentially been financing Americans, what you might call profligate lifestyles. You know, their nice big cars, their big houses, their trips to the malls. That's financed by China. China buys U.S. Treasury bonds. They're called Treasury bills, basically. That is debt. And what China's basically doing is it's the biggest creditor to the U.S. Now, I was saying before that the national debt is over $14 trillion, right? Most of that is held by the actual federal government, but about $1 trillion, a little more, is held by China. And a third of all of China's capital reserves, about a little over 30% of it, is U.S. debt, which is why China has been making some noises of concern about an outcome to this situation. It's not that China's being all altruistic and has the well-being of Americans. It has the well-being of the U.S. dollar, which it holds. It knows that if the U.S. economy were to go pear-shaped as a result of a potentially disastrous default, the dollar could plunge in value. All of its holdings would suddenly be eviscerated in their value. China's saying basically that the U.S. government should take prudent measures in order to reassure markets and investors that everything is going to be okay.
In China's best interest that this gets resolved, and quickly. Many
Absolutely.
thanks for telling us all about that. Douglas Herbert, our international affairs editor. And that's it for this half hour of Live from Paris. Laura Shattuck will be back with the headlines in just a couple of moments. Do stay with us.
The Muslim Brotherhood is no longer afraid to show its face. The movement, banned in Egypt since 1954, has been allowed to establish its own political party to run in next September's parliamentary elections. Their influence continues to grow thanks to their charity work, which includes providing aid and free education to the poor. But who are they really? Does the Brotherhood really seek a democratic future in Egypt? Reporters, today, 10:10 a.m. Paris time on France 24.